my name is Demetri Broxton, and I am the chair for DEAI for Bay Area Emerging Museum Professionals, and I'm joined with my colleague, Naomi Neal.
Hello, I am the secretary for Bay Area EMP, and I've been secretary since February 2020. So I'm a pandemic board member.
And this is the third and final segment of our series, Land That Job, where we bring job advice for emerging museum professionals. This topic is really centered on museum studies. We have colleagues with us who are both in the museum studies field in terms of education, as well as those who are not. And we're really investigating the topics of the value of a museum studies degree and other alternate pathways that you could take to enter into the very interesting field of museum studies or of museums as a career. And with that, I would love for our panelists to please introduce yourselves for the audience. I'll start off in the order that I see on my screen. So Omar.
Hello, everyone. My name is Omar Eaton-Martinez. I'm currently the Senior Vice President for Historic Sites at the National Trust for Historic Preservation. I formerly have worked at the Maryland National Capital Parks and Planning Commission, running historic sites in Prince George's County, Maryland, which is right outside of DC. I also worked at the Smithsonian at the National Museum of American History. And I also was a park ranger for the National Park Service, but I started my career as a teacher in DC and in New York City. So I was born in DC, raised in Silver Spring. My parents came to the mainland of the United States from a beautiful island called Puerto Rico. So thank you for having me.
Awesome. And Soli, please.
I guess good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Solimar Salas. I also go by Soli. Pronouns she, her, ella. I am currently the Vice President for Content Innovation and Outreach at the Museum of Latin American Art. You can see it behind me. We're located in Long Beach, California. I am originally from Puerto Rico, and I've been here at MOLA for the last 4 years. And I am also currently a Vice President at the California Association of Museums. Very happy to be here and partake. Thank you.
Awesome. And the wonderful Christine.
Thank you, guys. Hi, everybody. My name is Christine Fogarty. I'm the Associate Director of the Global Museum at San Francisco State University, which is the research wing of the Museum Studies program, which offers a minor and also a master's degree in Museum Studies. I was one of those accidental museum employees, actually finding out about the field when I was in school, and then got found at San Francisco State and just stayed in museums. So I'm glad to be here and looking forward to sharing some tips and thoughts. Thank you.
I just want to start off by saying that it's just really amazing to have such this amazing BIPOC group right here of folks that are really high in their respected fields within the museums. Is not something that we see often enough. And so that's something I want to start off by celebrating with the three of you in particular. And Christine, you kind of started us off a little bit with the story. You didn't go too deep into it, but I would love to hear from all three of you as to, how did you end up in the museum field? What was your pathway? In any order.
Okay. Well, I'll just since I started it. I actually didn't quite know what to do in college. I was a first generation student and my family is Filipino. I'm first generation. I was born in California native. And my family were either teachers or nurses. So I was kind of pre-programmed like, okay, I'm going to be a teacher or a nurse. But when I hit college and had gone through all the GE, I discovered art history and art. And I was like, I really love this stuff. I mean, this is just amazing that there's culture and different forms of art. And I just want to figure out how to get into it. But I didn't quite know what kind of jobs were out there. And I was not a museum goer growing up either. I was a military kid, so we moved around a lot and I lived in different places. So I was exposed to different cultures, but museum going was not actually in my lifetime. And I didn't start going into museums or going to museums until I was in college, and trying to figure out how to get into there was interesting. So it was through classes, of course. I took a museum and gallery operations class at San Jose State, and which led me to a student position at a university museum and to the graduate program at SF State, and have never not been in a museum since. So that's kind of how I ended up in museums.
Awesome. Anyone else want to jump in on that?
I'll jump in because mine is not a very traditional situation. And Demetri laughs because he knows my story. So I've been working in fine art museums, and I want to make that very specific, fine art museums, for the last 22 years. Nevertheless, none of my degrees are in fine arts. And just as also a disclaimer, I've never been in the curatorial conceptual part of the museums. I've always been in other areas. So in terms of education, my bachelor's degree is in biological anthropology. So I've always been interested in human beings and like just the evolutionary part of it. I never thought I'd work in a museum. I was one of those kids that just graduated my 4 years, just wanted to complete it. I decided I did my university in the US, and then I flew back home. I was like, okay, I'm going back home. This is it. I don't know what consulting is. This is 1998. So I just dated myself. It's fine. And when I landed back at home, I said, what about, I have to get a job. So I went into retail and I ended up working in a bookstore. I've always loved books. I'm a library rat at heart. While I was there, I thought, okay, I can't be here all my life. So I need to figure out what I'm going to do. So I ended up going into an MBA program in Puerto Rico, concentrating in IT, management of IT. So that's how I get into tech. I'm an accidental techie. I complete that degree, but while that's happening, I decide to change jobs and I get out of retail. And in Puerto Rico, there was this headhunting company, and somehow they got my resume. They were looking for people in the humanities, just general humanities, because Puerto Rico was going to open up a museum. And in June 28, 2000, I started to work at the Museo de Arte de Puerto Rico, which is one of the biggest art museums in Puerto Rico, together with the Museo de Arte de Ponce, and together with the Museo de Arte Contemporáneo and the university's museum, Museo de Arte, Historia y Antropología of the Puerto Rico University. So those are like the four main museums, and there's more, obviously, but that's going to take up half this session. So I complete my MBA in tech, and I'm like, okay, so I'm going to go in to get a tech job. But the museum doesn't let me go, and I can't let go of the museums because I've been a museum person junkie for a really long time. And working in the backstage, you start to thrive in the chaos and in the adrenaline that gives you. So after a while, my supervisor, my boss, who's still my boss, saw potential, and that's when she said, you really should try and get a degree in museum studies just to further along your career opportunities. And I said, all right, so I'll bite the bullet. And that's how I ended up in the Johns Hopkins Museum's studies program. So I in particular for me, it allowed me to study remote and keep working. And after that, I graduated 2014 of that degree. And then I started teaching museum studies in the Caribbean University. That's a university in Puerto Rico. And then when I moved, I had to stop that because there was not enough bandwidth to go around. And that's how I ended up in a fine arts museum, still in museums, can't let go, thriving on the chaos with a gala a month away. So that's so it's not a traditional story, but yeah, and I wouldn't change it.
That's awesome. And Omar, who many of us know from AAM and AAAM.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I grew up in DC, so obviously I understood museums, I understood memorials and monuments and those types of things. And I went when my family from Puerto Rico would come. That's when I went to the monuments, and occasionally that's when we would go to the museum. But it wasn't something I grew up going to. Even when I would go to Puerto Rico, I would never go inside El Morro. We would go in the lawn in front of El Morro, where we fly kites and have a picnic. But I've probably been inside El Morro twice under the age of 18 and didn't even know it was a National Park Service site until I became a park ranger many moons after that. But I started, my most direct segue into museums was when I was a teacher in New York City. I started to really branch out and do a lot of different teacher workshops. And I noticed that museums would do teacher workshops. And so I got interested in it that way. Then I worked at NASA as an informal education specialist, where I was giving the workshops to museum folks and other people who were outside of K through 12. In that was my first professional engagement with museums, where I actually hosted a conference at the Coachland Museum of Science, which is part of the National Academy of Sciences in DC. And I also had done some collaboration with the National Museum of the American Indian at the Smithsonian. When I left NASA, I was there as a contractor. The contract ended. I'm sort of hyped on this museum thing now. So I try to get into the Smithsonian, and I get someone to help me with my resume, put it in, excited, just to find out that they pulled the job, right? So I'm kind of back to square one. So then I went back to teaching. I taught at DC Public Schools for a couple of years. And then I ended up going to the National Park Service because one of my good friends, Dr. Lavelle Merritt, who we grew up together in Silver Spring, he was always sort of like the tree hugger of our crew. Like, he loved the plants. And he was like, Omar, you should really look into the National Park Service. And I was like, I'm not a tree hugger like that. You don't understand. It's cultural resources, it's natural resources. And so then I started doing my homework based on what he would share with me. And I was like, yes. I had no idea. Growing up in DC around all these historic sites, I never had a full appreciation of it, even though I was a social studies teacher and always had loved history and culture. And so at the time, the government had a non-competitive hiring authority called STEP and SCEP. And at the time, I was transitioning out of teaching and doing a master's online in educational leadership, which qualified me as a STEP candidate. So I was introduced to some people from the National Park Service who had some capacity to hire, and they were able to use this special hiring authority, which means I did not have to go on USAjobs.com. All I had to do was present my resume, meet with the people, interview with the people, and they were able to hire me non-competitively. I took that opportunity and I made the most of it. And I worked in the National Park Service as a ranger at the Mary McLeod Bethune Council House. Then I went to the headquarters of that park called the National Capital Parks East, and I worked with youth programs. I ended up becoming a tree hugger. I did environmental justice stuff with the Anacostia watershed. And then I worked intermittently with the office of the National Museum of the American Latino Commission, which is how I met Solimar, because she was still at Museo de Arte. And we had done a public hearing at Museo de Arte. And so I worked on that intermittently. And then I decided to, I built up my network that way. I met some people at the Smithsonian. There was a job in American history as a program manager. And that's how I got into the Smithsonian, doing that work, running the intern and fellows program, where I helped diversify the program and the recruitment from 18% to as high as 50%, depending on the cycle. And so all that was done through a series of being honest about who we were as an institution, making authentic relationships with people that cared about the same things I did, and really just being out there and vulnerable and humble in that space. I think a lot of times we represent these institutions and we're not humble at all. And we're very paternalistic in how we partner. And so I tried my best to stand in the gap and disrupt that. And that's how I end up really starting to build my work and my portfolio as a museum professional.
Wow, that's incredible.
Yes, that is wonderful. And honestly, those type of lessons that you're just speaking on, Omar, makes me want to ask everyone as well, because you've all had non-traditional ways of approaching a museum career. What are some lessons that you would encourage emerging museum professionals to know as they navigate their way through this field? Because there's no one way of being successful. And that's what I really love to hear from all of your stories.
I think if to kind of piggyback on what Omar said is like taking risks. I think looking back on my own career, I think I was held back a little bit because I was still kind of like trying to figure out, well, what are museums are about? Who are the people? How do I get to those people? And just being in a place that's not quite informed. So really just kind of putting yourself out there. So that means attending conferences, doing workshops, making the most of the connections that you have, like through internships, your instructors, if you have them, and really kind of leveraging who they know and trying to get to the people who are good models. I think that was what helped me navigating, was like finding really good mentors who were able to advise me along the way. And just making the most of those opportunities. It could be through internships. It could be, jobs that you find out that your connections give to you. It's just, as long as you're out there. And I think it's still kind of hard for me to also network too. But once you do it, it just kind of comes naturally. So I love what Omar said about being out there, being humble, and being authentic too, and developing relationships with people who think in the same vein and have the same interests as you.
I completely agree with Christine. Networking is such a big part of just getting ahead. Another thing I wanted to add is be happy with what you're doing. So find your passion within this industry. Because that's what's going to allow you to find joy in just working in the hard days, the good days, the success, the failures. You have to at least be I don't want to say satisfied, but be happy that this is what you want to do for a really long time. Be it the curatorial part, be it the project management side, be it the development side. Because that will allow you to also see non-traditional ways in which a non-for-profit works, but also how the for-profit works. And then how do you include what's happening on the other side of the profit non-profit line, and then how can you adapt it to a non-profit situation in a museum? If you at least find joy in whatever area of the museum field you're in, you're able to amplify that gamut. And understand that the nonprofit part of the museum benefits whenever we can find nonprofit or profit specific situations that we can apply and adapt into what the nonprofit field can benefit from. So I think just be sure that out of the 365 days a year, at least 300 of those years, you're happy you're getting up and you're going to work.
Absolutely. And I really appreciate that, tying in how if you have the initiative to adapt your passion, then it'll be recognized amongst the people around you, especially in a field like this where it's very visible to see what people's efforts are. Omar?
Yeah, I think that it's really important for students and emerging professionals not to wait to participate in professional associations. I know a lot of people make that mistake and think, well, I'm not a professional yet. I don't have a full-time job with benefits, so therefore I should not be a part of these professional associations. When the reality is we are begging for you to be a part of this. Like you are the sole reason why we exist in many ways. And so I really encourage people to get out there, attend. A lot of these associations have scholarships for emerging people, scholarships for diversity, diverse people from diverse backgrounds. And so a lot of times, I'm telling you, I'm part of many of these associations, as Demetri alluded to, and a lot of times we are like at the deadline, like we get hardly any applicants for these scholarships. So don't think, it's a little competitive once they come in, but it's not impossible for you to get. You don't have to be like some 4.0 student with 12 internships, 12 unpaid internships like that under your belt to do it. You just have to show a passion, have a little bit of vision for yourself. And that's my second part, is that I find that individuals are not coming into this space with a professional vision. Hear me out, because I'm not saying you have to know exactly what you want to do, but you should know what type of impact you hope to create in this world, in this space, right? When I talk to people about professional vision, I used to say, well, I want to be the first Afro-Latino secretary of the Smithsonian that actually cares about community building and community engagement at the national level, right? That's what I want to do. I want to transform communities and transform people through informing the conscience of the communities by doing the work that we do in art, history, and culture. Well, guess what? That's a conversation starter. You talk to people about that when you're in your internship, they're going to latch on to you and they're not going to want to let you go. And so and then the other part of having a professional vision, especially in the earlier side of your career, is that you should allow it to evolve. Your internship should inform that space. So what you say day one should not be the same day one. It shouldn't be. And it shouldn't be the same year 2, year 3, and year 5. It should evolve as your experiences continue to snowball and get bigger and bigger, and your lens of this job starts to become more granular. Not to say you're going to be more specific on one thing, but understand that you're going to understand the different components to make up this work. A lot of times people think everybody in the museum is a curator. We all know that's not true. We all know that's not true. There's a curator and director. That's all we got. No, we have more than that. And a lot of the people doing the other jobs are really the ones that are keeping the integrity of that space. And so we need to tell people that. We need to tell people that museum work is social justice work, right? We don't need to be shy about that. We need to, if you really care about your community, and you really think that you want to be impactful, look at museums as a space for that. I know it started off as the colonial project, but there's been a lot of good disruptors in the last 50 years to change that story. And you can be a part of that narrative. And so I think it's really about reframing this sector to this new generation of professionals.
That's awesome. I am loving all of your responses, and I'm like, okay, I feel energized. This feels like I'm going to church with all the wisdom that you are all bringing to us. We are all aware that things have changed over this last 2 years since you know, I like to say that we had 2 pandemics. One of them is this ongoing health issue that is continuing to happen, even though everyone likes to pretend it's over. That's still impacting particularly low-income people and people of color at the highest rates. But also this heightened awareness of the racial issues going on within this country. So kind of given this landscape and people also, still sheltering in place and working remotely, at least on a hybrid basis, what do you think has really changed in the museum field over the last 2 years that's having a particular effect on emerging professionals, or things that they should be aware of? And I know that that's a big question.
I can try. For the work that we were doing in Prince George's County, I mean, obviously everyone went through this sort of virtual pivot, but really the biggest aha moment for us in terms of interpreting our sites, and I dealt with a lot of sites of enslavement and places like that, which are very traumatic spaces, is to interpret the grounds, right? How do we have people who can actually do sound and compelling interpretation of the grounds so that you don't even have to go inside the space. You can enjoy being outside in nature, but also understand that the ground that you stand on is a sacred space. It's a space of extreme trauma for certain people. And really, not even for certain people, for everybody, I would argue, it's because everybody had a role in that trauma. And if you had a role in that trauma, whatever your role is, you want to say protagonist or antagonist, I'm not going to even go there. But the idea is you had a role in it, your ancestors had a role in it, or people that you identify with as some type of affinity to had a role in it. And so it's just a new space for us to really be contemplative, to really cut to the heart of the matter so that people can have a transformational experience to really change the shape of how we dialogue. I'm no longer in the game to try to convince you. My thing is just, I just want you to be able to put you in a better position to see the humanity in someone else. If I do that, I win and I'm done. Right? It doesn't matter. And I always tell people all the time, if I felt like I can't do that in museum space, public history and preservation work, I'll find something else.
That's really wonderful. Solimar, did you get a chance to answer? I'm sorry, I wasn't.
No, I haven't answered. Can you refresh the question again? Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just really given how things have changed over these last 2 years. I think Omar really addressed the, that we now no longer have to really, we can openly talk about racism and the racial impact and history of sites, really. But, what other things have changed over the last 2 years that emerging professionals should be aware of when entering into the field of museums?
I think, and I'll handle it. I guess I want to address more of the staffing and managerial aspect of it. And we're all very aware that the last 2 years have provoked a very steep change in terms of how we work, because we've learned that a lot of us can work remote. You still find some institutions that are still in that pre-COVID mentality of everybody on site, of everybody present. As you're going into the field, change will come to the industry. I firmly believe that, but change in museums doesn't come quickly. So some museums have been able to adapt better to offering options of work remote, hybrid schedules, which I think it's something that we all learned that it's beneficial in a way for a lot of the admin side, front end side of a museum. It's hard to do this because your job is there. But as you're looking at jobs in a museum, not all of them are offering those opportunities. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't, that you should immediately eschew that. If that is a priority for you, then that's perfectly fine. But understand that the industry, again, change doesn't come as quickly as we would like it to be. And as the generations that are the decision makers now will not be so in 5-10 years, there's a separation of time that if you want to be part of that change long term, then you probably need to put up with some things now that you maybe are not comfortable with. Again, I was the one that was selling happiness at the beginning, but I also want to give a different perspective now. And it's the fact that we need to be patient, but we need to be here to actually provoke that change. So again, there's growth pains in any industry. This is part of how you sort of carry on to evolve that. So I think for me, that's been one of the greatest changes in the last couple of years, because you still have a lot of that old style management in multiple, not all, but in multiple museums. And I think for us to carry through that change, some of us will need to, I guess, figure out how we can influence that from the inside now, so that in 5-10 years, and this is the registrar talking to me, in 5-10 years, we can see that change. So I guess it's my aspect is more of that internal culture and how do we change it moving forward. So I hope that answered the question.
Oh, for sure. I love that you shifted into, thinking about how the museums are managed. And kind of in that same vein, Christine, I'd love to hear what you think in terms of museum studies programs.
Yeah, I was just going to say, to underscore what Solimar said about internal culture, I think that, and what Omar said about how this field can be really impactful. What gives me hope about this field is the emerging museum professionals, because you guys are at the forefront of what the entrenched and established museum professionals want in their spaces. I think that you are at that point where you could help transform, like Solimar said. I don't know how else to say, other than, that's what museum studies programs to me are useful, is that you get a sense of all of the trends that are happening in the field, how to navigate internal culture. You're also learning about, if you're at the nascent part of your career, you're in a safe space learning about how to handle collections, how to develop exhibits, how to engage audiences. You're at the ground level, and you bring your interests and your hopes and your dreams. I know it sounds pie in the sky, but it's really, I think emerging museum professionals are where it's at. They are going to help transform, because as you are being trained in all of these 21st century museum practice, the old guard are going to retire eventually and make space for some of the Gen Xers and Gen Zers who are going to come into leadership. And if you have a better understanding of just the field and how to have that professional vision that Omar mentioned for yourself, but also the impact that your museum or museums in general can have, I think that's what really makes me hopeful that we will see the museum that reflects the diversity of our society. And I think museum studies programs are great for that.
That's a beautiful answer. Thank you all for adding such wonderful context to not just your experiences, but the hopes that you have for the future of museums. I wanted to kind of add on to that about, old school management, how people approach new openings within museums, thinking that they need a master's, PhD, or even higher to get a specific type of role in a museum, and also that it needs to be specifically within museum studies. I come from a background of kind of where they are at an intersection. I know before we started this, I kind of mentioned it before, but I studied cultural heritage management with Johns Hopkins. And so it also really intersected with their museum studies program. And what I really appreciated from it was that it kind of brought a more modern take of taking accountability into who interprets the tangible and intangible heritage that a lot of museums are responsible for. And so that leads me to my question of, do you think that museum studies are absolutely necessary for people to have if they want to join the museum sector? Or are there other fields that could help, the museum fields go forward?
So I can jump in. Straightforward answered, I think no, you don't need a museum studies degree to be successful in the field. And we have Omar here as a wonderful example. I do think it helps to cover some of those black spots when you're just learning the tool and the trade and the insides of a museum. It helps to fill those lagoons, right, of how do I figure this out? Because you don't have to reinvent the wheel. Somebody's already written a book about registration methods. So, and that's just one example. And different books keep coming out of about different evolving types of education. But what, again, and like Omar mentioned, museums are not just made up of curators, be it in anthropology, history, fine arts, crafts, whatever your museum collects. There's so much more that a museum needs to actually work. And then, for example, in an education field, having people, professionals that have been teachers, that have their degrees in teachers, that understand curriculum development, that understand that field, that's what makes that education program stronger. They don't necessarily have to have a museum studies degree. It's great if they do, but when I'm looking to hire for my team, I want expertise in the field that I need support in. I'm not necessarily looking for, did they get a George Washington University Museum Studies degree? They get the Johns Hopkins degree, they get the Caribbean University degree. Because at the end of the day, and this goes across the board, and we may edit this outside of this, but if you're mediocre at what you're doing, entonces then what are you putting forth? It's like, don't get a museum degree if just to get it, just for the paper. Okay, again, that's not going to help you or your institution. If you want to get that archaeology degree, and that's what's going to make you be really good at collection management, because you can do condition reports in a very detailed way, well, then that's what you're going to do. And then that leads into I want to go and look at bones today. Yes. So no, you don't need to pay that expensive or whatever degree that you want, it will help because it did help me. So I'm not going to completely take that away, but you also have to develop other areas, and internships are a great opportunity for that, because development is not my favorite part of the job. But depending on what level you are in a museum, you end up doing development anyway and pitching it. So we have wonderful museum development professionals out there, fundraisers and membership people that like to work with like people and managing members and what can I do for my members. They may not need a museum's degree, but they'll work in a museum and then they'll get to know the exhibitions, they'll get to know the collection, they'll get to know the people. It all sort of feeds off each other. But anyway, this is my soapbox, so I'm just going to stand down.
We love this soapbox. We love it.
And give space to others to chime in.
I agree too. I don't think that you need a museum studies degree. I do believe that it helps. It helped me at least position myself for, I guess, management or that kind of level of administration. But also, I think I value universal skills. Are you able to write? Are you able to adapt and be nimble when the situation calls for it? Are you able to be an empathic leader? Can you mentor your lower staff or your assistants or even the students that are interning for you? Do you have, really, can you talk? You're public speaking all the time, right? I'm looking for the skills that will help whatever job that I'm posting for, to help me do the work. And if you can gain those experiences through internships, through jobs, even in adjacent jobs, like say you're a marketing person or a designer. Did you know that museums have designers too? You could be a graphic designer. You could use those skills and help museums advance that way. So think about universally what your skill set is. You have a baseline. You need to be able to talk. You need to be able to write. You need to be able to have a really strong work ethic and be collaborative and work on a team. Because I think that's what museums are. Is it's all about collaboration. You can't do it on your own. You have to do it within a team mentality. So if you could do that, then you build your experiences through internships, through classes, whatever it is. It could even just be like professional workshops or certificates. You don't have to go and get a whole degree. Maybe a certificate in museum studies will help just to fill in the gap. Or even say you're a volunteer manager, get a certificate in volunteer administration. That also positions you for higher up positions. So I think universal skills and being able to transfer those skills from museum sector to other sectors and back are really key. Because I think Demetri, I'm always thinking of Demetri because he was in museums for the longest time. He was in my class, in education class back in the day. And he called me up one day and he said, you know, I'm not, he knows the story. He's like, I'm not getting where I need to be at my museum. And I feel like I have to leave to gain other things. And I think it takes a lot of strength to be able to realize that sometimes you have to leave the field to be able to, you know, maybe get more money, maybe to gain more skills. And that's okay. Sometimes museums don't work out, but if you can gain those skills and ultimately get back in museums, you will have grown a little bit more, but also position yourself higher for a higher paying position. So I'm always thinking of that when I'm thinking about universal skills.
No.
I don't know. I think Solimar and Christine asked the question. I don't think I would have a different answer based on my own personal experience. But also I would say based on my experience running the intern program for so long. I think museum studies degrees, whether graduate degrees, bachelor degrees, or certificates, only mean anything when you do an internship or have a job. When you have the opportunity to put theory to practice in a meaningful way and make it your own, then the museum studies thing all of a sudden it matters, right?
Yeah.
It illuminates. But without that, there's no illumination. Right? You need the practice. You need the opportunity to actually, you know, put those things in action. I always tell I have 4 children and one who's in college now. And I've always told her, like, it's not about getting into Harvard or getting into Smith or whatever, highfalutin school that's on your mind. It's more about what you do when you're there. Surely you're going to get good grades, but if you are the head or the president of STA or your Black Student Union, Latino Student Union, and you're doing externships and internships, that's going to carry much more weight than everybody talks about the name all the time. Like that means something, but it really doesn't mean as much as what everybody thinks. Like, I don't want to be dismissive of it. Obviously, when people see that you went to Harvard or something like that, people's eyes do still light up. But in terms of like practically assessing and evaluating that individual and their skill set, I don't think it means a whole lot. What it means is much better if you have the internships and you do the extracurriculars that show your passion, that show your leadership, that show your ability to be professional, your ability to be able to speak publicly, your ability to strategize. Like if you can demonstrate that, people are going to latch on to you.
I'm gonna break form just for a quick second and just say, I mean, I've worked at 3 different museums in my career so far, and one of the things that a museum studies degree and just going through the program did for me is be able to see the museum as a system and understand all the parts, that operate, because everybody's going to focus in whatever area you're most excited about, right? And I just have to say, it really frustrates me when management, the upper management, don't understand those systems. And sure, you can go to AAM, you can look at ethics, you can figure out, what the processes and procedures are to be a professional museum. But oftentimes those people have no idea. And so they make things up. Either they're pulling it up from the corporate world, or they're just doing what they think rather than going with the AAM or ICOM. Solely put in the chat the new ICOM definition of museums, which I think is essential. I do want to talk about that and how you all think that that's going to change. But I just want to throw in that I'm like, not the museum studies allow you to understand how a museum is supposed to run outside of your specialty area. And that's one of the things that I find really frustrating, and oftentimes having conversations with colleagues, like I was a colleague with Naomi at a museum. And once you go through the programs, you start to understand, oh, we're supposed to have, this is how our mission goes, this is our vision, this is what stewardship of these objects mean and how we should interpret them. It's just really interesting. So anyway, I'm sidebarring into that to say my frustration. I don't know if anyone has anything to add to that, but I do want to talk about the new definition from ICOM. I also put in the chat, like I'm waiting for AAM to follow suit with this also. So Soli, I don't know if you want to kick that one off actually, since you put that into the chat.
So I completely agree with Demetri as well, because I think that the lagoons that I was talking about in terms of lack of knowledge in certain areas, I think that Demetri was able to express it a lot more comprehensively. But yes, so let's talk about museums. So I think because we were commenting on this shift of museums and what's changed in the last 2 years, part of the situation was that we were operating museums as the definition of what these associations define museums to be as, right? And the last version of it, I think, was from just the subtle changes from like a 1970s definition. They're very subtle. So this year in the ICOM's the International Council of Museums, a structured body of professionals. They had a conference in Eastern Europe, Prague, I think it was. And this is the new definition that they announced. A museum is a not-for-profit permanent institution in the service of society that researches, collects, conserves, interprets, and exhibits tangible and intangible heritage, open to the public, accessible and inclusive. Museums foster diversity and sustainability. They operate and communicate ethically, professionally, and with the participation of communities, offering varied experiences for education, enjoyment, reflection, and knowledge sharing. So we definitely start seeing that shift that decades ago, AAM was also talking about when we were saying that museums were turning into visitor-oriented institutions, right? Responding to what the public wants us to do. So I think these two sentences are responding to that need to see diversity, to have a different narrative and context, like Omar was saying, in terms of how do you understand the space? How do you read the space? How do you experience it? But open to the different narratives that one space has for the different audiences. And how are we opening up those channels of communication so that it's not just one narrative? And like and I'll talk a little bit about what we've been trying to do at MOLA is Latin America is a very big melting pot, and it's gone through a lot. Genocide, it's gone through colorism, racism, among other isms, and it's still happening. That's not like tapar eso con la mano. I'm sorry, I can't translate that one. May need another cup of coffee. But it's something that then with this new definition, there's a lot more comfort, and it's another way to communicate to boards. It's another way to communicate to the executive teams in institutions that these are conversations that we need to start having. One of the things that we've been starting to do at MOLA, and they started a few years ago, we just made it part of a permanent program, is that cultural narrative, that cultural program that we do, where we talk about Afro-Latinos, where we talk about Asian and Pacific Island Latinos, because it's a mix. We're not, our geography is not limiting us anymore in terms of keeping the purity of the ethnicity. Okay, ethnicity and race are different issues, and I need people to understand that. So it's definitely something that now museums, we need to lose that fear of talking about these things. We just need to do the due diligence to look for the professionals that have the tools to talk about this, and also the people with experience, and then put it into a context where we're opening up these conversations and discussions. So I'll stop there, because then we'll get to another soapbox.
but I think this also is just, you know, I remember reading about this new definition of museums with ICOM, and I know initially they wanted to be much more revolutionary than where they landed at. But I think even with these subtle changes of just a few words, it opens up opportunities for emerging professionals or even people who are in adjacent fields who are thinking about like how they can impact museums. I just kind of wonder if you think that if this will change maybe the entryway for emerging professionals. Like I think in 2020, there was an opening where I suddenly found myself being recruited by institutions that ignored me for decades.
I feel like we need another hour. Okay, we've been talking about this. I'm all in favor of the Heritage Months and the celebrations, because we do need to have those spaces to highlight our heritage, our culture, where we come from, what makes us unique, what brings us together. But yes, there's a tendency, and you see it in marketing as well. When very particular events happen, then you start to see how the industry also responds to that. I tend to look at the glass half full, and I'm like, ¿sabe qué? If nace the DEI movement, awesome. So what I'm doing is I'm pitching more. I need and I want my interns to be more representative of my community. Okay, that's what's going to give them the tools that they need to then, for me to start seeing a lot more diversity at a higher level. Okay, again, and without going into a lot of details, when you're in recruitment, you need to have spaces where you give the universal skills that Christine was talking about. And internships are a great way to do that. So that all of our community can also feel that there's not an imposter syndrome, that you're meant to be there. I had imposter syndrome when at certain points in my career, because we're like, oh my God, it's like not working out. I was like, what's going on? But you need to build that structure for that next generation. And that's what I was talking about in terms of looking at the change. You're not going to see it in a year, but if I can prep the way so that I can see it in 5, 10 years, then that's what we need to do. And if this definition is going to be my anchor to get other conservatives to start understanding that this movement is not just lip service, it's something that we need to stand behind, then maybe this will also help to get more stipends, to have honorariums that we can pay for interns instead of calling them volunteers. So it's a way to say, let's see how we work with what we got, but then how do we make it better? And understanding what those things are along the way. Again, I wish things would change in a year, but after 22 years, you sort of get it. That's just, it's hard to happen. But yeah, so I'm hopeful.
Absolutely. And I wanted to, before we ask our final question for the session, I did want to add on my little opinion that representation is also important within your leadership, and that's where it truly starts. That's the foundation of it all. You can't fill in your diversity within frontline staff and then think that the work is done there, because whether or not you think that they feel like they belong, they truly won't feel that, because it'll be imposter syndrome, because I don't see leadership that reflects who I am or reflects who the community is. And so how can you fully be an inclusive museum if you don't have that on every level, every tier? But before I ask our last question, I did want to thank all three of you for coming here and just really giving such beautiful perspectives of your own experience and your own hopes for what museums can be. I think the future for it is going to be really great. I think the generations coming up are being more vocal, or being, you know, like I'm talking about them like I'm not part of them, but I think that there's going to be a lot of wonderful change and things that just truly just make things a lot better for the communities that are growing with museums as well. For our last question, we wanted to ask, you know, what advice would you give someone who's thinking about, or even just entering, like very fresh, very new, entering the museum fields, like they're just finishing their degrees, or maybe they're halfway through and they don't really see much guidance, or they're thinking of changing altogether to be more involved with museums? What advice would you give to them?
I would say just remember, and it's a little bit of what Omar and Soli talked about in different ways, is that your first job is not your last job. Look at each job as an opportunity to grow and take advantage of the opportunities like grants, conferences, workshops. Really immerse yourself in the field. If it takes going to get a museum studies degree to do that, if you can think about that long-term vision that you have for yourself, then I think that that could also be a way to go. But in all of this, to be open-minded and to also be your authentic self going forward. So all of that, and also take risks, because I wish I took a little bit more risks when I was younger. I don't even, how long have I been in the field? Over 20 years too. But I wish I took a little bit more risks to make better decisions, but I wouldn't change it, because I still ended up in the place where I wanted to be, and to impact too the next generation of museum professionals is what keeps me going, is having all their hopes and dreams be my hopes and dreams too, and to see them actually enact the change.
Thank you. I think people have to be able to find something that they care about, that they see the museum not addressing, and stand in the gap. Once you stand in the gap, the knowledge, skills, and abilities will come because you care, right? And who knows what that's going to be? Maybe that's some chief diversity officer thing. Maybe that's a curator. Maybe that's a community engagement specialist. But it's going to be because you saw a gap, you identified it, and you addressed it. And you addressed it by, first of all, caring for it, but also building a network of people to help support you in that work who may not exist in your own institution. Like now in 2022, almost 2023, there's so many people that you can connect with through Zoom, through whatever Twitter sphere. I mean, there's a couple of closed groups I'm still a part of from like 10 years ago, right? Because we were looking, way pre-pandemic, we were looking just for camaraderie around these issues and support and next practices and all those type of things. So I think, you know, once you identify the gap in your institution, you begin to address it, assuming that you don't have any support or any mentorship in your immediate institution, when you look for it, you know, around the globe. And I think that's an easier thing to be able to tell you now than maybe 15, 20 years ago when it wasn't as accessible.
I just feel I talked a lot, so.
Any closing thoughts though that you want to leave folks with?
I think Omar and Christine pretty much summed everything up. If you're passionate about what you're doing, and you're open to all of these other different experiences, because you may have to have a part-time job while you're doing a non-paid internship. Understand that each and every job you have goes back to feed into what you will become within a museum. Because, and I'll give one example, I started off as an associate registrar. I drew from my inventory clerk at retail in a bookstore knowledge to start looking at inventory for when you're looking at a collection. I drew from cashier and customer service management when having to talk to collectors and artists. So do not minimize any experience in work, because all of that you can repurpose to then be even more diverse in what you can offer and bring to any museum that you work in. And I think that those would be my parting words.
Oh my gosh, this has been such an incredible conversation. I have so much love and respect for all of you, and it just keeps growing. I'm so amazed by you.
I love you guys too. This is really heartening.
Yes, that is very inspiring. As someone who's been out of museums for a few years now, this is very encouraging, especially with what Christine said earlier about just because you leave for a bit doesn't mean that you can't come back and you can't bring those new skills that you learned along with it. But yes, absolutely.
Maybe you come back as a trustee.
Yeah.
There you go. There you go.
Again, diversity has to hit all the points.
Yeah.
And again, it's not just internally, Mira, in those boards. Why not? You can still help museums at that level. You don't have to be like the 9-to-5 person. It's just keeping yourself open.
Demetri can tell you I can be the worst nightmare when it comes to needing ethics and procedures. So.
Exactly. And we love you for it. We love you for it.
Like, where are they? Where are they? I don't see them. But yes, thank you all so much. I really do appreciate it. Again, Demetri, you were much more suited to close this out. So please.
No, not at all. Not at all. But yes, I do want to thank all of our wonderful panelists, as well as the visitors, the attendees to this. Just to let you know, this conversation will be immediately available on Bay Area Emerging Museum Professionals Facebook page. We did record the session, and it will also show up on our YouTube page. So please share far and wide with your networks, and thank you so much. We love you and appreciate you for your knowledge or wisdom and just who you are and out in this world. It's so inspiring to know that the three of you exist and are shaping the next generation, as well as your institutions. That gives me so much hope. Thank you. Have a wonderful, wonderful weekend, you all.
Thank you.
Thank you
so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.